We will call the meeting for Thursday, February the 7th to order. Senator Cluse, do you have some guests with us today?
I do, Mr. Chairman. One guest in particular, and it's Connor. Connor, stand up, wave your hand. Everybody welcome Connor, and he's from Linden.
Good. Welcome, Connor. We're glad you're here. Are there, Cindy?
Thank you, Mr.
Holscher?
Chair. Thank you. That's fine. Cindy's good. I also have a couple of pages here today in the second row. If you want to stand up and or wave, I have Ellie Bustamante with Accelerated Schools of Overland Park. And, oh gosh, and now I have brain fade. Oh, Piper, right? Sound it out. Okay, they waved, so we're good.
Okay. Any other introductions? Okay, we will now turn our attention to a hearing on Senate Bill 85. Eileen, would you like to give us a bill brief, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. You almost never see me bring a computer up here, but I actually was working on this bill brief last night, and which is why you have a separate copy of the brief in front of you. Please use that one instead of the one that reads like I don't speak English as a first language. This is Senate Bill 85, which enacts the Kansas Travel Insurance Act. I'm going to refer to it in the brief as an act, as the act, which has been Kansasified, but is largely based on the NAIC Model Travel Insurance Act. The bill would enact 10 new provisions of law, and it also amends KSA 40-4903, providing the description of travel insurance as a line of authority in which an agent may receive qualifications for licensure. The Act provides a detailed and comprehensive system for the regulation of travel insurance in the state. And because the bill is so long and detailed, I'm only going to take a few moments to describe what each section of the bill does and leave the specifics to the conferees to speak to if there are questions. So Section 1 of the bill provides the citation of the Act and also specifies that this Act will be a part of and supplemental to Article 2 of Chapter 40 of the Kansas Statutes Annotated. Section 2 of the bill states the purpose and states to whom the Act applies. Namely, the Act applies to travel insurance that is sold, solicited, negotiated, or offered in the state, and policies and certificates that are delivered or issued for delivery in the state. Section 2 also states the provisions of the Act would supersede any general provisions of law that would otherwise apply to travel insurance. Section 3 is the definitions section for the Act. Section 4 of the bill provides requirements for the licensing of limited lines travel insurance producers and the registration of travel retailers that may sell travel insurance under the license of the limited lines travel insurance producer. The section also describes the activities in which a registered travel retailer may engage. Section 5 of the bill sets forth a premium tax that would be paid by travel insurers. Section 6 of the bill provides the requirements that must be satisfied in order for travel protection plans to be offered for one price, combining different benefits into one package. Section 7 of the bill provides the requirements for the sales and marketing of travel insurance and what would constitute an unfair trade practice under KSA 40-2401 at SEEK. That's the Kansas Unfair Trade Practices Act. Section 8 sets forth a requirement that must be satisfied in order for a person to be a travel administrator. Section 9 provides that travel insurance shall be classified and filed for purposes of rates and forms under an inland marine line of insurance. Section 10 authorizes the commissioner to adopt rules and regulations to implement and enforce the Act. And Section 11 provides a description of travel insurance for purposes of categorization as a line of insurance. And finally, if this bill were enacted, the bill would have a delayed effective date of January 1st, 2024. And with that, Mr. Chair, I can stand for questions.
Thank you, Eileen. Committee, are there questions? I see none. Thank you. We will now turn our attention to the proponents. We have Michael Byrne on behalf of the U.S. Travel Insurance Association. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for your time this morning. I never realized that legislation was that long until I heard the description, so apologies. I think we think it's as long as it needs to be, but no longer. My name is Michael Byrne. I represent the United States Travel Insurance Association. The USTIA's members include insurance carriers, third-party administrators, insurance agencies, and related businesses in the development, administration, and sale of travel insurance and travel assistance products. Thank you for bringing Senate Bill 85 before the committee today. SB 85 is important for travel consumers, state insurance regulators, and the industry. SB 85 contains Model Act language from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, which is all of the chief insurance regulators in the United States. And the model is essentially identical to a Model Act authored by the National Council of Insurance Legislators, otherwise known as NCOIL. 29 states have enacted the model so far. Several other states are considering the Model Act this or next session. SB 85, if enacted, would amend the insurance code to clarify the regulatory framework for the sale of travel insurance on a national uniform basis. The bill standardizes definitions and contains consumer protections, including with respect to sales practices, a free look period for refunds, and various consumer disclosures. It expands on the limited line licensing of travel insurance agents already permitted in Kansas. USTIA and other industry participants support the legislation, which we have reviewed with the insurance department. They're here today to answer any questions that you might have. We are not aware of any opposition. Thank you for your time and consideration. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Michael, thank you very much for your testimony. Are there questions? Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you look at this, when we look at this legislation, is it identical in the framework as it's been passed in other states? And how many other states have passed this, if it is identical?
It is identical in all substantive respects. I think it was mentioned it's been Kansified, so there's different conventions that different states use, but substantively it's the same in all the 29 states that have adopted it so far.
Committee, additional questions? I see none. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Are there additional proponents that would like to testify on Senate Bill 85? Any neutral? Any opposition? Seeing none, we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 85. We will now turn our attention to Senate Bill 44, enacting the Kansas Financial Institutions Information Security Act. Eileen?
And again, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Senate Bill 44 enacts the Kansas Financial Institutions Information Security Act, which is a mouthful, so I'll call it the Act throughout the brief. The Act consists of 4 new provisions of law requiring state-regulated covered entities to establish an information security program to protect customer information consistent with the provisions of 16 CFR Section 314, which actually applies to the federally regulated financial institutions over which the FTC has jurisdiction. Section 1 of the Act establishes the Act and specifies to whom the Act applies. This section also grants authority to the Bank Commissioner to establish rules and regulations that are necessary to govern and administer the provisions of the Act. Section 2 is the definition section of the Act. Section 3 specifies the required elements of an information security program, again to mirror the federal provisions. And Section 4 specifies that the Bank Commissioner may conduct routine examinations of covered entities, as well as examinations of covered entities that the Commissioner may conduct if there's reason to believe that the covered entity is engaging or has engaged in actions in violation of the Act. This section also sets forth actions the Commissioner may take in furtherance of an examination and penalties for violations of the Act. And the section also states that any enforcement action required or requested by the Bank Commissioner shall be subject to the Kansas Administrative Procedure Act and shall be subject to review under the Kansas Judicial Review Act. And with that, Mr. Chair, I can stand for questions.
Thank you, Eileen. Are there questions? I see none. Thank you. Okay, we will now turn our attention to the proponents. We have Brock Roller, General Counsel with the OSBC. Welcome, Brock.
Thank you, Chairman Longbine and members of the committee. As stated, my name is Brock Rayler. I'm General Counsel for the Office of the State Bank Commissioner. I do have with me today some additional colleagues. I have Assistant Deputy Director of Examinations Jim Payne, Director of Information Technology Matt Hodges, and IT Examination Manager Kylie Fine. Depending on your questions, we may have them answer some of your more technical questions. So the Office of the State Bank Commissioner requested and is a proponent to Senate Bill 44, which is the Financial Institution Information Security Act, where I will follow Eileen's lead and call it the Act. I first want to start off by saying that this Act does not create any additional regulatory burden. The entities have to do nothing more than what is required under federal law. In fact, that is specifically stated in the state law that the federal law applies. This act would also be reviewed through our typical examination process, and no additional employees will be needed to enforce this bill. Since this is part of our normal examination process, there will not be additional examinations. The second thing I want to point out is this would only apply to the entities that are covered under the FTC law. There will be no additional entities that are subject to our review based on this bill. The FTC Safeguards Rule states that financial institutions must set standards for developing, implementing, and maintaining reasonable administrative, technical, and physical safeguards to protect the security, confidentiality, and integrity of customer information. We feel now is the time to bring this and make sure that this is being enforced because data breaches are becoming a lot more common. We're 5 weeks into 2023, and there's already been data breaches at T-Mobile, Twitter, and PayPal. Now, large or small, financial institutions hold very valuable information on their customers. So we feel that since they hold the most critical data, it is very important for us to make sure that Kansas consumers are protected. Now, there is no way to legislate away data breaches, but by giving us the authority to enforce this act, this will ensure that entities under our supervision are not unduly putting Kansas consumers' sensitive information at risk. So Chairman Longbine and members of the committee, I thank you for allowing me to submit proponent testimony. We will be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Brock, thank you very much. Committee, other questions? Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this might be an Eileen question. I apologize. So in Section 4, it's a new bill, new statute. So in Section 4, you have a lot of actions that can be taken if you find someone's violated this act. Are those things that you don't currently have the ability to do? Can you issue subpoenas now? Can you?
We can, and some of our acts specifically state that entities under, like the Uniform Consumer Credit Code, they have to enforce federal law. The reason that we're putting this all in one place is if there's a change to the FTC Safeguards Rule, it's going to apply to multiple different acts. It's going to be covered under the Banking Code, UCCC, KMBA, Kansas Money Transmitter Act. It's really a lot easier to have it in one bill. But to answer your question, yes, we do have enforcement ability. We do not intend on using that. Our intent with all of our licensees is to get voluntary compliance. But it is there in case we do have someone that chooses to not want to follow the FTC Safeguards Rule.
May I just?
You may.
Add, just so I understand, and thank you for explaining that. So in our new Section 4, you can currently do all of those enforcement procedures. This isn't that part's not anything new to your current authority and actions?
That is correct. There is a little bit of a question if the FTC has given states authority to enforce their act, unlike other state agencies that specifically say it by statute or regulation. The FTC has not chosen to do so.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Senator Pittman.
Thank you for the testimony and appreciate your efforts to make our banks safe with IT, of course. I do question, what is it we're really trying to do here? You already have the authority and we already have the federal authority on this. And are we introducing something here as a state agency, you kind of went through that we're not introducing anything new. So we've got to ask the question, well, why are we doing it then? You know, what's the benefit that you're getting by doing it other than centralizing the statute? What is it that, that you're going to be able to enforce that you can't already enforce under the federal legislation, you know? Is it just to make us feel good? I want to understand more about what the benefit is from a state of going through this. And if it's not really doing anything more than what we can do today, why would we be doing that?
Yeah. Well, as I stated, the FTC is not specifically put in statute or regulation that state agencies can enforce their act. And so there's always a question on what was the legislative intent of the federal statute or regulation, if that was supposed to be only enforced by federal law. But if we enact the state law, then we give ourselves the authority to do so. The second point I have is we're already in the exams and we're already there. It's just one more additional thing that we can check to make sure that the Kansas consumers are protected.
Is it something to do with the fact that the state chartered versus federal chartered? Does that have something to do with what you're talking about here? FTC rules are applied uniformly across both right now?
I'm sorry, what was the second part?
Are the FTC standards enforced across both state and federally chartered banks?
It's actually state and federal chartered banks are not subject to the FTC safeguards rule. They are covered under their federal regulator with either the FDIC or Federal Reserve, which is why we specifically exempted them from this particular act, because we already have enforcement authority under state chartered banks, and we certainly do not intend to enforce any safeguards rule on any federally chartered bank.
Okay, Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the testimony this morning. It's important to keep our non-public, personally identifying financial information safe and secure, so I appreciate the intent here. I'm concerned, like maybe some of the other questions have been related to the authority that this would grant the office, and particularly in Section 4. It sounds like some of these are already in place, but I'm wondering, are there any standards set forth regarding Section 4, for instance, the issuing a subpoena? Does it have to be a unanimous vote of the board? Does it have to be a 2/3 vote of the board? Do there have to be findings of fact for the issuance of the subpoena? Fines and civil penalties can be assessed by the commissioner up to $5,000 per violation. And again, there's no opportunity, I would think, for the covered entity to be heard to dispute that until, I guess, after it's already assessed. You can go through the Administrative Procedure Act and then on to Kansas Judicial Review, which is a lengthy process for a covered entity. The Act would provide that, if I'm reading it right, that the commissioner could enter into a memorandum of understanding or consent order with a covered entity, which would then govern the forward looking transactions and operating of the covered entity, and could in fact refuse to renew the registration or licensure of the covered entity. So I'm just wondering, there aren't any, it seems to me, maybe there are, I just don't see them, opportunity for the covered entity to be heard before these actions would be taken by the commissioner. Do we have those kind of safeguards in place to make sure that this quite extensive authority is used properly?
We do have a dialogue as part of the examination, and this is actually nothing new. We have that same authority under UCCC, KMBA, all of our acts. And as part of the examination process, we do have a dialogue, and we certainly don't want to cite something as a violation that is not a violation of law. So we do try to talk about that with the entities under our examination.
I would just want to see some, it seems pretty wide open, the authority granted in this bill, and just want to make sure that both for consumer protection purposes and for our covered entities that we're striking the right balance there. So those were some of my concerns that I had looking at it, that there's no vote of the board or anything required before some of these actions are taken or findings of fact. So those are my concerns. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Holscher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. I just want to make sure I understand, too. This kind of goes back to Senator Pittman's question. If I'm understanding correctly, the requirements are there, but not enforced. And that enforcement comes in the form of the potentially routine examinations, and then actions can be taken as a result of those examinations. Am I piecing that together right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then, so as far as it says in here that if it's believed the entity is engaging or engaged in actions in violation. So are we talking about like cases where breaches keep happening? Is that where, then, is that the red flag that we're talking about that causes or prompts the examination?
Well, if it's discovered, like we get like a consumer complaint or something like that, we would want to specifically look at an entity outside of a routine exam. So I really can't think of any other type of situation that we would have knowledge about a violation and want to look into it, unless we got a consumer complaint or maybe there was a press release about a data breach and consumers are saying my information was stolen. We might want to look into it at that point.
Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brock, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, in your examinations, do the Kansas banks do a pretty good job in this area, or are you spotting any weaknesses? That's my first question. Second, 2022 data breaches, have we got any idea of what kind of issue this is looking back?
You want to answer that question? Okay. Yeah. I'm going to have Kylie Feiner, our IT manager, answer that question. She's the one that actually conducts most exams.
Morning,
Morning.
Mr. Chairman and senators of the committee. To answer your question, I do want to start by clarifying this particular act applies really only to non-bank institutions. So our banks are already federally regulated by the federal banking agencies, both the FDIC and FRB. So what our act here is really looking to establish is some of these enforcement abilities in the space of your non-bank entities, your mortgage lenders, your payday lenders, consumer lending and what have you. So this particular act is allowing us to be a little bit more active and kind of clearing up the air in that space. Those entities are actually not regulated by anybody else other than us, the ones that I just mentioned. So while our banks are being regulated and supervised by both the state and the federal agencies on a very regular basis, our companies in the non-bank space are not. This is trying to get us more pointed in that direction, but because the banks are more traditionally supervised, breaches and what have you have been limited.
Thank you.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. That helps clear up a lot of the concerns that I had. Appreciate knowing who the covered entities are with a little more clarity. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You stated that the covered entities are only regulated by you. As far as safeguards are concerned, aren't they also regulated by FTC?
So the FTC does not actively supervise entities here in Kansas that we know of. I don't believe they are performing examinations. We can refer to the FTC, but the extent of follow-up in our referral, in the instances that we do, note a violation with their own safeguards rule, the FTC safeguards rule, the extent that it's followed up on is very limited to our knowledge. So we would like to do more at the Kansas level to help those companies that we notice exceptions, get to a better point as far as security goes, strengthen the security posture. And I believe this particular act helps us do that with them. We can work alongside them.
Thank you. Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My previous years in banking, security was our number one priority, and we spent the most money on. We're rated, we always had a Camel rating or one. But, I mean, now we're moving to these payday loans and mortgage companies. I see the value in it. I mean, there's a lot of secure information. And I'm guessing unless someone is acting in a very, very bad way, they would probably, if there was a problem, be put under an order or memorandum. And as long as they perform, they would be fine, probably before they would have a lot of fines or that's normally how this works. I mean, you normally don't get the big fine unless you're intentionally doing some very bad stuff. And so, you migrate towards that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for your comments. I would like to add as well that we are absolutely in the nature of being constructive in this process. We do not like to go the route of enforcement actions unless we've explored all other opportunities and avenues as far as working with the company goes to strengthen the security program. We do value that greatly.
Okay. Senator Pittman?
Thanks for your testimony up there. It seems like we're expanding some of your authority quite a bit, and not arguing that it doesn't need to be on. I think Senator Olson made a good point about the constructive nature of your business and why that's a good thing. But we are talking about a lot more entities, yeah? And I would hope, I mean, if you're going to do that and you're only responding to consumer complaints, I don't see how that's a very comprehensive approach to it. Like you're very comprehensive in terms of how you approach the state chartered banks and how you look at the whole profile. This seems like you're going into the next layer, right, of entities that are interacting with the banks, trying to secure those. And I don't see how you can do that without more resources and more technologies or more processes to go out and review those if you're not already out there looking at those entities now. Maybe you could respond to that.
Absolutely, Senator. Thank you. So I think it's been nearly about 3 years now since we've started to examine some of these non-bank companies. So we, with the current staff, have been looking at about 20 to 30 non-bank entities in those 3 years since we've really expanded this initiative. All those entities that we've discussed, we do have supervision powers under the UCCC. So they are in our scope of jurisdiction. But we, as an agency, have expanded the IT examination team within those 3 years. So we brought on resources, but we have been operating, like I said, about 20 to 30 companies, and we believe that is a pretty fair pace, certainly a sustainable pace of examination. To answer your question, we start first and foremost by prioritizing these companies based on a risk impact. So the number of Kansas consumers, the size, and just kind of the nature of their activities. So we start at the top and try to work our way through some of Kansas's biggest players. So we know from an impact standpoint, just kind of, the reach and what have you.
Thanks. That's very helpful.
All right. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Are there additional proponents on Senate Bill 44? Any neutrals? Okay, we will now turn our attention to the opponents. We have Pat Barnes, General Counsel with the Kansas Auto Dealers Association. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Longbein, members of the committee, I'm Pat Barnes. I'm General Counsel for the Kansas Automobile Dealers Association. I'm here today with their president, Don McNeely, and we also have the assistance of Whitney Dameron as our legislative counsel and Hannah Eubanks, who is one of our managers. We're here today in opposition to Senate Bill 44. Our view of Senate Bill 44 is that it would change the law by enacting a new act in Kansas that would essentially be used to enforce what has become known under federal law as the Safeguards Rule. It does deal with consumer and customer information and financial information. What you need to be aware is that this law is applied to vehicle dealers and is already in effect and applicable to our members by virtue of the federal rules, which are currently reserved to and enforced by the Federal Trade Commission. Additionally, we are regulated by numerous agencies already as to various aspects of our business and really don't need to have more. It constitutes an expense that ultimately is price inflationary to consumers, serves no real purpose, and is burdensome as applied. In fact, when the FTC adopted the expanded safeguard rule on party line vote of 3-2 in September 21, Commissioners Noah Joshua Phillips and Christine L. Wilson wrote in their dissenting statement, regularly reviewing our rules to ensure that they address the current environment is an important part of the FTC's regular process. But rules have far-reaching and frequently unintended impacts in the real world. When imposing additional legal obligations in the rulemaking context, we must do so with great care. The amended safeguards rule replaces a rule that has worked well for 20 years, a rule that took a principle-based approach in order to provide financial institutions flexibility to determine the appropriate and realistic security safeguards for their organizations. The record before us at best fails to convince that the changes are necessary and at worst raises concern that the substantial costs and risks in imposing these amendments, accordingly we dissent. So we respectfully request that you exempt us from the proposed state act. It renders the interpretation potentially different from what the Federal Trade Commission might impose upon us. It exposes us to varied ways that this could be enforced. It potentially brings additional costs on us, and dealers are already licensed under KSA 8-2402 at SEEK and have regulators that can and do review what we do and how we act. Expanding this act to dealers would subject them to potentially Byzantine regulations and enforcement by various agencies, including OSBC, because it creates the likelihood of varying regulatory requirements and interpretations. I've bullet pointed a number of reasons toward the second page in the lower section of my testimony that really set out a lot of our concerns. And that is the potential for expense, overregulation, and unintended invasiveness of business operations. It's already costing dealers and customers thousands of dollars for existing compliance without adding more to it. Such rules would open the door to conflicting or additional overreaching, potential misuse of the regulatory process due to breadth and lack of specificity, the reality of how statutes intended for specific purposes are being sought to be stretched for opportunities by unintended uses where there is no guidance to stop it without extensive litigation, using unintended laws to seek penalties for routine or innocent mistakes of no effect. The existing ability to enforce FTC, Federal Reserve, and other rules commonly exercised by state regulatory authorities. And you can see the comments in the Revisor of Statutes sections that are part of both the Kansas Consumer Protection Act and Uniform Consumer Credit Code. Many of them do refer to FTC rules and commentary. And then also, liability already exists in civil law for failure to address cybersecurity, and it's well known in the headlines. In the end, there is ample reason to conclude that our members have adequate incentive to protect data and customer information. Exempting our dealers is reasonable given the regulatory attention already placed upon us. In the end, the question becomes how a regular person, like dealer personnel, are supposed to navigate all of these laws together with so many people taking shots at them, or unable to do it. It impedes commerce at some point and makes consumer inflation law-driven and market-driven, and adds the two together. So on behalf of my members, we would like to be exempted from this. It's easily done. I wanted to also point out that even under the Dealers and Manufacturers Licensing Act, we started way back in the mid-90s to deal with these situations. And some of the earliest laws on cybersecurity and use of data were passed by this legislature as applied to car dealers back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so if you look at 82410, that is the broad part of the Dealers and Licensing Act that has various prohibitions in it. And one of the things we're required to do to avoid a prohibition under our own regulatory act is to comply with all of the laws that apply to us, which this would be already. Also, if you look at subsection B of 8-2410, there's a laundry list of things in there, but among them is subsection B4. And it deals with data and how it's used and what you can do with it. So there isn't a want for any of this being addressed under state law. If something happened with one of our dealerships, I can assure you that it would be addressed by somebody. And in many cases, some of the things that occur are fairly minor, but they come down with a fairly large hammer nonetheless because they result in lawsuits, consumer protection claims, and things of that nature. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have, and we appreciate the time you've allowed us to spend on this.
Committee, are there any questions? Senator Fagg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation, Pat. You're talking about the FTC that they reserve to and enforce by. Do they, I'm learning on this deal, do they actually come in and look at a dealership, you know, with what they do, or when do they show up? How do they examine?
It's hard to say what they decide to use for focus, but they do. And when they do come in, it's one of the worst things that can happen to you because they do use the big hammer.
Yeah.
And their fines are not just $5,000. They're generally running in the tens of thousands of dollars. And do they work with you? Not much. So they don't come in and do an audit like on a regular basis like various other agencies do. But if you get on their radar, it's pretty comprehensive.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can I direct a question to Eileen real quick? Yeah. Eileen, does this act as it stands, would it cover these dealerships? Is it definitive that they are inside of this, they would be covered by this? Or is that kind of a gray area?
If you look at section 2B, that might help.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Section 2 of the bill states that a covered entity means each person, applicant, registrant, or licensee subject to regulation by the Office of State Bank Commissioner. That's not directly regulated by a federal banking agency. And then in Section 1, it specifically states that the act applies to the handling of customer information by the following covered entities. So Section 1, subsection C is a subset of Section 2, subsection B. And I, without additional research, I would say no, I don't think it applies to the group that the conferee is speaking to. It applies to credit services organizations, mortgage companies, federal financial institutions engaging in consumer credit transactions, financial institutions engaging in money transmission, and then the TEFIs that are a relatively new entity. Unless the auto dealers are considered financial institutions, and I don't believe they are, this would not apply.
Thank you.
Additional questions? See none. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any additional opponents like to testify on Senate Bill 44? See none. We will close the hearing on Senate Bill 44, and we will now turn our attention to Senate Bill 51, authorizing the State Bank Commissioner to accept state and national criminal history records from private entities. Eileen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Senate Bill 51 amends KSA 9-2301 and 9-2302 of the Fiduciary Financial Institutions Act, or ACT, to authorize the bank commissioner to accept criminal history record checks performed by entities other than the KBI or the FBI. So Section 1 of the bill amends KSA 92301, which is the definitions section of the Act, and it's been amended to add definitions of director, officer, organizer, and private entity. And please note here that private entity is being specifically defined as an entity other than the KBI or the FBI that can provide a state or national criminal history record check. Section 2 of the bill amends KSA 92302 to authorize the commissioner or the state banking board to accept a state or national criminal history record check from a private entity if the KBI or the FBI is unable to provide such criminal history record checks. This section also specifies that the results of a state or federal criminal history record check are confidential, not subject to the Kansas Open Records Act, and shall not be used for any purpose other than those specified in statute. And unauthorized disclosure of the results of a criminal history record check would be classified as a Class A non-person misdemeanor. Finally, if the bill were to be favorably acted upon, it would become effective upon its publication in the Kansas Register. And with that, Mr. Chair, I can stand for questions.
Thank you, Eileen. Are there questions? I see none. Thank you. We will now turn our attention to the proponents. Brock, you're back up.
Thank you, Chairman Longbine and members of the committee. The OSBC requested this bill, and we, of course, are proponents. I first want to clarify that we strongly prefer to receive background checks from the FBI. That is why we worded this particular act the way it was, that we cannot use private background checks unless we cannot receive background checks from the KBI and FBI. Just a little bit of history. This is the third time we've been trying to update the TEPI Act, so at this time, I think it's appropriate that we have some sort of backup plan. So when we last passed the bill to update the background checks, we received some additional information from the FBI as to what is needed. They are requiring that we include definitions of officers, directors, and organizers, which those are the parties that are subject to background checks. We also were asked to make it confidential per state law and restricted on their use as specified in the TEPI Act. We also recognize that the TEPI Act stated the State Banking Board is the only one that can request the background checks, which that is not our typical practice. The Office of the State Bank Commissioner has a routine practice under banking code and pretty much all of our statutes that we will request and review the federal background checks. In this case, we would be doing it on behalf of the State Banking Board, which makes the ultimate decision on any approved application. So again, the language that we've added for private background checks, that is not our intent. It's only if we're unable to go through the proper process with the FBI. With that, Chairman Longbine and members of the committee, I will close my testimony, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Brock. Just a quick question. I'm as frustrated as anybody with the fingerprinting that we do in the state of Kansas and the lack of response we get from the FBI. What kind of trust level do you have with the private entities? I have, in my business, used some of those and found the accuracy is not always there. So how do we protect ourselves against false records, lack of records within these private services that you would have to end up using?
I share your opinion. We much rather get the FBI background checks because you are correct. They are the most thorough and most comprehensive. At the same time, where we are right now, we can't get any background check information for any officer, director, or organizer, and quite frankly, that's scary. So if we're unable to use the proper channels, then we would certainly, as a last resort, like to use the private background checks.
Committee, are there additional questions? I see none. Thank you. We now have neutral testimony from Robert Jacobs, Executive Officer with the KBI. Welcome, Robert.
Good morning, Chairman Longbine and members of the committee. My name is Robert Jacobs. I'm the Executive Officer of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. and I appreciate the opportunity to come up and speak with you and provide neutral testimony on Senate Bill 51. Eileen did a great job of explaining the bill, specifically the additions of the definitions for director, officer, and organizer, and private entity. And really, to provide a little bit of background, I wanted to tell you what some of the efforts that are being done by the KBI currently, and this may help with your decision and contemplation over this bill. So we recognize the frustration that has been going on with the FBI and some of the national background checks that were done. This is not sole to or singular to the Banking Commission. Unfortunately, many entities are having struggles with that. And really what it comes down to, just to be honest, is the fact that the FBI is consistently changing the requirements of what they want to see in statute. That language has to be very specific to allow the national record information to go back to that entity. And so what has happened is every time a fingerprint background check bill comes through that includes a bill that includes that, if it's passed, the KBI takes that bill, we send it to the FBI to see if the language that's in that bill is approved by the FBI, and thus allowing us to give fingerprint background checks from the national level. Many times that reply is no, it's not good enough. And so what happens is we end up having to go back the next year and amend that language to fix it. So what happened was multiple years, this went on multiple years, and states started complaining to the FBI saying, well, you allowed this to happen, you allowed the language to work last year, but now you're not allowing it to work. And so believe it or not, the FBI said, okay, well, let's now look at those old languages. and they started going back, and our fear is they're going to start denying all these other statutes that are already on the books that allow for fingerprint background checks because they've changed their requirements. So, some background here. Since 1978, the KBI has been statutorily required to maintain criminal history records for the state of Kansas. And we provide civil criminal fingerprint criminal history record checks for many entities. In fact, there's approximately 77 statutes that have a fingerprint background check included in them. And some of these entities are for Board of Nursing to licensing nurses, Board of Education to certify teachers. We know that KDADS, DCF, all of those things use record checks as well as the banking industry. So what the KBI decided to do this year was we approached the revisor's office in early fall to look at restructuring the statute around fingerprint background checks that would make a single statute that defined what was in a fingerprint background check or what was needed for that. And then we're going to redirect those 77 statutes to this one statute. That way, in the future, if anyone decides to change the requirements for national fingerprint background checks, we have to fix one statute, not 77. And so we are currently in the final revisions of that bill right now. We hope to introduce it very soon because we're running out of time. And so, but we do believe that this bill will help alleviate some of the frustrations around national fingerprint background checks and getting those records. One other piece I want to add to my testimony about this is the overall concern, as you mentioned already, with using private entities to do record checks. The big issue around fingerprint background checks is the fingerprints. That's the best way to tie an individual to their particular criminal history. The only group that can do that, you have to be a criminal justice entity to request a fingerprint background check. Anyone that's not cannot do fingerprints. And so that's why KBI and many others around the state do that, or local law enforcement. But what we're trying to do is, the problem with private entities is that name checks are sometimes unreliable, as you mentioned. The accuracy can be unreliable as well. But more importantly, a private entity if you're not doing a fingerprint background checks, you don't have access to the expunged criminal histories. So if a person has a criminal history, they've committed a crime, they've gone to the courts, they've had that crime expunged, when they do just a private entity criminal history check, if it's not tied to the fingerprint, that will not show up. You could have somebody who legitimately would be eligible for a job because they don't meet a disqualifier because of their crime has been expunged, who then is refused that job because the private entity still shows that crime on their record. I hope that makes sense. So that's our only other concern about the use of private entities, the matter of the expunged records. We do hope, in summary, we are putting together a bill that will hopefully alleviate not only the need for Senate Bill 51, but many other problems throughout the statutes with fingerprint record checks for other entities. And we hope to have that passed this session. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Robert, thank you for your testimony. Committee, are there questions? I see none. Thank you. Are there any additional proponents, opponents, or neutral testimony to Senate Bill 51? I see none. We will close the hearing on Senate Bill 51. Committee, that concludes our work today. Tomorrow we will be working, hearing a couple of housing bills that I know are extremely important. So we are adjourned.